Hey guys, I just shot my first of 3 days of my highest volume ever photography gig. This is what I found. When it comes to needing to get the shot now, I so much prefer my 6D to my Alpha 6300, and that's coming from someone who's very strongly biased towards mirrorless. Now there are a few things that this comes down to: lens selection and autofocus, in my opinion. I was using my 6D with my 70-200 f4L IS-USM and my Alpha 6300 with the 50-100 from Sigma Art f1.8 through the MC11. All the firmware is up to date. Let's dive into lens selection first. While the 50-100 on the Alpha 6300 doesn't have to deal with front and back focusing issues that need to be adjusted for with like AF micro adjust, there are a few ways to maximize its performance. Basically putting it into AFC instead of AFS, autofocus continuous, and that basically does it. That will maximize your shooting experience in terms of autofocus performance. But it still sucked. Let's dive into why. I use this combo, the 50-100 and the Alpha 6300, to get action shots of the kids that were playing soccer that I was photographing moving around. And 3 to 6 year olds don't exactly move quickly. However, they did move much quicker and much slower both than I expected, but either way, it was too fast for the autofocus motor. I had the Alpha 6300 set up to the wide area AF, and while it could track the subjects fairly easily and fairly well, it had a really hard time locking on, sometimes taking several seconds. Alternately, on my 6D with the 70-200, I could track, using the center autofocus point, I could track these kids running around like hoodlums like a dream. For all the flack that the 6D and the 6D Mark II get for their autofocus performance, for acquiring and tracking subjects, that's never really been an issue for me, specifically with that center autofocus point that I trust implicitly. But these lenses don't only differ in aperture, The 50-100 by itself is probably as heavy as the 6D and the 70-200 together. It's a pain. As a person who prefers mirrorless for a lot of reasons, all this kind of coming together really blew my mind. The result was that when I got home and realized that for all practical purposes, I preferred the 6D, a DSLR, my world kind of fell apart around, my photographic preferences world kind of fell apart around me. Now, I had my partner set up to take the portraits with the 50-100 and the Alpha 6300 when I was using the Canon setup, and she loved it. But, I was thinking through it, and I was trying to figure out what was the problem when I got home. I hadn't had this brainwave in the field, unfortunately, but what I quickly realized was that I wasn't comparing apples to apples. I used the center autofocus point on the 6D and the wide area AF on the Alpha 6300. When I limit the Alpha 6300 to the center point or the flexible small, medium, large point, whatever you prefer, and put it in the middle, lock it in the middle, I get nearly equivalent performance, if not equivalent performance, on the 50-100, even though the focusing element is much bigger, front elements, it's all way bigger, the depth of field is much shallower. With the AFC still on, in my highly unscientific studio testing, they performed equivalently. Suddenly my Alpha 6300 was performing as well as I wanted it to, just like I wanted it to. It wasn't about DSLR versus mirrorless. It was about tuning the autofocus performance to what I was comfortable with. And it was about tuning that autofocus performance to equivalent parameters that I was comfortable with. But since I'm still in AFC, because that's where the 50-100 works best on the Sony body, I can still use face detect and eye detect AF, something which you can't do on any DSLR body without going into live view and suffering the resultant performance loss. Now, the end result of this is that my partner will be using the 50-100 with the Alpha 6300. She prefers the focal range, the depth of field, the face detect, the eye AF. She prefers putting it on the monopod and not having to deal with the weight that way. So it's going to work out really well for the portraits. that's just, I'm accommodating her preference with that because I'm really glad that she's doing it with me and she doesn't have to be, so I'm very thankful for that. But the moral of the story is that when you're comparing DSLR and mirrorless, oftentimes two radically different animals, you have to compare apples to apples. And that's where the differences arise. In my case, that's leaving AFC on with the center point and still having face detect and IAF, whereas on my DSLR, on my 6D, and on any DSLR, with the mirror down, there's no face detect or IAF. Perhaps more importantly though, you need to know how you shoot. I came up on the XS and the 6D, where I basically only used the center autofocus point. But on my Alpha 6300, I've never used that center autofocus point, even though that's what I'm most familiar with. The huge upside to mirrorless is that you get to choose. I'm gonna be a lot more intentional going forward about learning about each of these features and trying to use them as much as I want to and need to in order to maximize the performance of my camera. I prefer mirrorless. I also prefer full frame. With what I've got now, I have to give up a little of both no matter what I'm shooting, and that's okay. My Alpha 6300 is great. My 6D is great. They can both be great without taking anything away from one another, or without it being a huge flame war over DSLR versus mirrorless. I can accept that my preferred shooting style, not necessarily the way the images come out, but the way I shoot, can be accommodated in different bodies, in different types of systems, without having to let go of my emotional attachment to and my preference for certain types of systems. I can continue to prefer what I prefer while accepting the big upsides that the alternative offers. And I would challenge you to do the same. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.